The taxi pulled away, leaving Pedro Gonzalez standing alone in the driveway. 28 days in the hospital had felt like a lifetime, and all he'd wanted was to come home to the lakeside house he'd built 35 years ago. But something was wrong. Cigarette smoke drifted from his front porch. The garden was overgrown with weeds, and when Pedro slid his brass key toward the lock, it wouldn't fit. The antique hardware was gone, replaced by a shiny digital smart lock with a camera staring back at him. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Roberto Morales, his son's father-in-law, stood there wearing Pedro's navy blue silk robe, the one Leticia had saved months to buy him for their 40th anniversary. In his hand was Pedro's world's best grandpa mug, steam rising from expensive hazelnut coffee. "Can I help you, buddy?" Roberto's voice was dismissive, looking at Pedro like a vagrant who'd wandered up from the highway. "Roberto, it's me, Pedro. What are you doing here? Why are you wearing my robe?" Roberto took a slow sip. "Oh, it's you. Bianca said you might show up. We didn't think they'd let you out of the loony bin this early." "Move aside," Pedro said, gripping his cane tighter. "I want to go into my house." Roberto laughed, blocking the doorway with his bulk. "Your house? You really are confused. This isn't your house anymore. It belongs to family now, and you don't look like family. You look like a liability." "Where's Raul? Let me in." "You're trespassing, old man. Turn around before I get nasty." Pedro stepped forward, rage overcoming weakness. "I built this house. Get out of my way." Roberto moved fast. His hand slammed into Pedro's chest, hot coffee splashing onto his shirt. Pedro stumbled backward, his cane slipping. He fell hard onto the concrete steps, his head cracking against stone. "Whoa there, old-timer. Don't make me call the cops." Roberto turned toward the house and whistled. "Buster, get him!" Pedro's heart stopped. Buster, his 12-year-old golden retriever, came trotting out, but the dog didn't attack. He bounded toward Pedro, burying his face in his neck, whining with joy. Roberto kicked Buster hard in the ribs. "Get off him, you useless mutt!" Buster yelped, cowering behind a column. That was when Pedro heard the rumble of his Ford F-150 pulling into the driveway. His son stepped out wearing an expensive Italian suit Pedro had never seen before. "Raul," Pedro called, "help me!" But Raul didn't run to him. He just sighed, like Pedro was trash on his lawn. Raul walked around the truck and opened the passenger door. Bianca stepped out in designer sunglasses, carrying a leather handbag. She looked at Pedro and wrinkled her nose. "I told you we should have changed the gate code," she said to Raul. "Now we have to deal with this scene." Raul walked up the path, stopping a few feet from his father. He didn't offer a hand. "Dad, what are you doing here? The hospital said you were being discharged to the care facility. You weren't supposed to come here." "This is my home." Pedro managed to sit up, leaning against the pillar. "Why is Roberto in my house? Help me up." Raul exchanged a look with Bianca. "Dad, we need to explain something. This isn't yours anymore. We made decisions while you were incapacitated, for your own good." "For my own good?" Pedro looked at Roberto in his robe. Bianca stepped forward. "We sold the truck to the business, transferred the deed, and moved my parents in. You require specialized care, Pedro, expensive care, so we handled your assets." Pedro felt the world spin. Then his eyes locked onto Bianca's neck. She was wearing Leticia's pearls, the ones he'd bought in 1989, the ones his wife had worn to every anniversary. Seeing them on Bianca felt like desecration. "Take them off," Pedro demanded, voice shaking. "Those belong to your mother-in-law. You have no right." Bianca just touched the necklace, smirking. She looked at Raul to handle it. Raul stepped between them. "Dad, stop! I spoke to Dr. Evans. He said the stroke caused cognitive damage. You're confused. You can't live alone. Don't you dare lie to me." Pedro straightened despite the pain. "My mind is fine. I built this house 40 years ago. I laid this foundation. This is my property." Raul rubbed his temples. "It's not your property anymore. We executed the power of attorney you signed before surgery. We transferred the title. It's done." Pedro's blood ran cold. They'd used the medical power of attorney to steal everything. "Why are your in-laws living here if this is for my protection?" Bianca's voice dripped condescension. "My parents are maintaining the property. You're incapable of providing care. You should be grateful we kept it in the family." Pedro lunged for the door, needing to reach his safe where the original documents were kept. Roberto stepped forward and shoved him hard. "Get back, old man!" Pedro flew backward, hitting the concrete steps again. His head cracked against stone. Pain exploded. Blood trickled down his forehead. "That's enough," Raul mumbled, looking away. "Get him in the car. We're taking him to Sunny Meadows." Roberto grabbed Pedro under the arms. Raul took his feet. They carried him to the truck like a piece of furniture, shoving him into the back seat. Roberto squeezed in beside him, pinning him against the door. "Wait, I'm bleeding. I need a doctor." "You're fine, Dad," Raul said from the front. "Just a scratch." Pedro reached for his phone, but Roberto clamped his wrist and snatched it away. "I'll take that." "Hand over the wallet, too," Raul said calmly. Roberto wrestled the wallet from Pedro's pocket and tossed both items to the front. Bianca caught them, dropping them into her handbag with a satisfied click. The truck lurched forward, speeding away from the lake house. They drove toward the industrial district, cracked pavement, broken streetlights, dying businesses. Bianca pulled out her phone and put it on speaker. "Yes, this is Mrs. Gonzalez. We're en route with the patient. The transport is secured." She listened. "We're 20 minutes out. Is the room ready? Good. And the isolation protocols? We don't want him wandering. He's very confused. Violent, too. He tried to attack my father." "Liar," Pedro hissed. She ignored him. "Just have the paperwork ready for Raul to sign. We have a dinner reservation. See you soon." She turned to look at Pedro. "You're going to a special place, a place where you can't hurt anyone." "What's Sunny Meadows?" "A facility that accepts state aid cases," Raul said quietly. "Since we transferred your assets, on paper you're indigent. You don't have money. This is the best we could do. You made me a pauper, and you're dumping me in a state home." 30 minutes later, they pulled into a parking lot surrounded by chain-link fence and razor wire. The sign read, "Sunny Meadows Extended Care." It looked like a prison, gray concrete stained with neglect, weeds everywhere. The smell, bleach, boiled cabbage, urine, hit Pedro even through closed windows. "I'm not going in there." Roberto grabbed his arm. "Easy way or hard way, Pedro?" They dragged him across the asphalt, his shoes scraping the ground, through automatic doors into stifling heat and yellowed linoleum. In the lobby, elderly people sat slumped in plastic chairs, staring at nothing. A massive woman in a white uniform stepped out. Her name tag read, "Head Nurse Hatcher." "This the admission?" she asked. Bianca handed over a file. "Pedro Gonzalez, non-compliant, high flight risk, aggressive." Hatcher flipped through papers. "Room 4B is secure." She grabbed Pedro's chin roughly, examining the cut on his forehead. Nasty bump, but he looks agitated. "I'm being kidnapped. Call the police." Hatcher looked at Raul with boredom. "Delusional, paranoid, common in late-stage cases." She snapped her fingers. 2 large orderlies appeared. "Take him to 4B. Prep 10 milligrams haloperidol. We need him calm." "No, Raul, don't let them do this. I'm your father." Raul looked at his shoes. Bianca checked her watch. Roberto smirked. The orderlies dragged Pedro down a dimly lit corridor. He fought, kicked, even bit one. The man twisted Pedro's arm until he cried out. They threw him into a tiny room with 4 beds crammed together. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and decay. They pushed him onto a bare mattress. Hatcher came in holding a syringe. "This is for your own good, sweetie. Just relax." "You can't do this. I have rights." "You have a guardian." She nodded toward the door where Raul was signing paperwork. "He says you need to sleep." The orderlies held him down, one on his legs, one on his chest. Pedro couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Through the door, he saw Raul hand back the clipboard. His son turned and walked away with Bianca and Roberto. Raul didn't look back. The needle pierced Pedro's shoulder. Cold liquid spread through his veins. The room swirled. The ceiling spun. His eyelids grew heavy. The last thing he saw was Hatcher's indifferent face. The last thing he felt was crushing betrayal. His freedom was gone. He was just a body in bed, 4B. The world went black. Pedro woke to screaming. A skeletal old man in the next bed was shouting, "The fire! The fire!" His mouth tasted like copper. His head throbbed. The Tag Heuer watch, gone. The call button didn't work. A tired young nurse entered. When Pedro asked to call a lawyer, she laughed. "A lawyer? That's cute. You get jello if you behave." "I demand to speak to someone." The nurse pulled out a clipboard. "Let me explain. You've been declared mentally incapacitated. Mr. Raul Gonzalez is your legal guardian. You can't sign checks, make decisions, or leave without permission. That's a lie. I'm perfectly sane. The paper says otherwise, signed by a judge. Your guardian restricted your communication privileges. He says you get confused on the phone. Pedro sank back. Brandon hadn't just locked him away, he'd silenced him. I want to speak to the administrator. She's busy. Lunch is in 10 minutes. Eat it. The nurse left. 10 minutes later, a tray arrived, gray, lukewarm sludge and white bread with green mold on the bottom. Pedro dropped the bread. This was the care his son had bought with millions, the cheapest facility, saving every penny while Pedro was expected to eat poison. The rage that filled him was cold and sharp. Not explosive anger, calculating resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. He sat for hours observing. Camera in the corner, light patterns, staff routine, checking every 4 hours, minimum effort. Around late afternoon, the door opened quietly. A young man in a gray jumpsuit pushed a mop bucket. His name tag read, Tommy. He mopped quickly, nervously. When he reached the bathroom corner, he stopped, looked up at the camera, stepped left into the blind spot where the lens couldn't see. He pulled out a smartphone. Pedro's heart skipped. A phone. Connection to the outside world. Tommy was breaking rules. Staff weren't allowed phones during shifts. He was afraid of being caught. That meant he could be bargained with. Pedro coughed deliberately. Tommy jumped, nearly dropping the phone. He shoved it back and spun around. Pedro held his gaze, raised his hand slowly, pointed to where his watch used to be. Nice phone, Pedro whispered. Tommy froze. Please, senor, don't tell my boss. He fires me. Pedro beckoned him closer. Tommy shuffled toward the bed, gripping his mop. I won't tell, Pedro said softly, but I need a favor. No favors, I just clean. Pedro reached down, grimacing. He rolled down his sock. There it was, the Rolex Submariner vintage his father had left him, worth $12,000, strapped around his ankle, a paranoid habit from years ago. He unbuckled it. Take it, real vintage Rolex. You can sell it for thousands. Just give me the phone. 10 minutes. Tommy's eyes widened. He knew what it was. He snatched the watch, shoving it deep into his pocket, and handed over the smartphone. 10 minutes, Tommy whispered, moving to the door to keep watch. Pedro dialed First National Bank. The automated system answered. He entered his account number, answered the security question. Ranger, his old German shepherd. Identity confirmed. Please wait. Seconds felt like hours. For checking account ending in 442, balance is $0. Pedro's stomach dropped. For high-yield savings ending in 889, balance is $0. For retirement investment account ending in 661, balance is $0. No, Pedro whispered. $850,000, gone. Please list last transactions. Transaction 1, transfer of $200,000 to Gonzalez Renovation, LLC. Transaction 2, transfer of $300,000 to Morales Holdings. Transaction 3, transfer of $350,000 to Morales Holdings. They'd drained everything, funneled it to Raul's company and Roberto's accounts. Time's up, Tommy hissed. Nurse coming. Pedro cleared the history and handed back the phone. He lay down, pulling the blanket up, feigning sleep. Footsteps stopped outside. A beep. Phone call connecting on speaker. Mrs. Gonzalez, this is Nurse Hatcher. It's Mr. Gonzalez. Bianca's busy. What's the issue? Raul's voice. About your father's medication. The doctor prescribed a neurotropic to rebuild neural pathways after the stroke. It costs $700 monthly, out of pocket. Pause. $700? That's steep. Is it necessary? Without it, combined with sedatives, he'll remain confused. He'll be docile, but not present. Long silence. Pedro held his breath. Listen, we're stretching the budget with house renovations. And if he becomes lucid, he just gets more agitated, violent. Don't fill the prescription, too expensive. Just keep him on sedatives. Keep him comfortable. Higher dose if needed to keep him quiet. So maintain sedation, decline restorative therapy? Yes, just keep him sleeping. Better for everyone. The line clicked dead. Pedro lay there, one tear rolling down. Not sadness. Realization. They weren't just greedy. They were killing him, systematically erasing Pedro Gonzalez. First property, then money, now his mind. If he stayed one more night, if they put another needle in his arm, he would never leave. Pedro sat up. The dizziness was still there, but rage was stronger. He looked at the window. barred, but the frame was old, rusted steel. He was a builder. He knew metal. He knew rust was weakness. He swung his legs over. His feet hit cold floor. He wasn't Pedro the victim anymore. He was a contractor with one last job. He had to break out of his own grave. Tonight. At 2 a.m., Pedro made his move. He'd spent 6 hours lying still, counting staff rounds. 10 p.m., midnight, next check at 4 a.m., 2-hour window. He pulled out his weapon from under the mattress, a spoon he'd been sharpening against concrete for 48 hours, a makeshift screwdriver. He moved to the door, hugging the wall to stay in the camera's blind spot, cracked it open. The hallway was empty, bathed in yellow safety lights. He didn't head for the main exit. That was alarmed. He headed for the utility wing. Footsteps approached, nowhere to hide except a laundry cart overflowing with soiled sheets. Pedro dove in, burrowing under filth. The stench, urine, sweat, vomit nearly made him gag. "Did you hear that?" A male voice. "Probably the pipes. This place is falling apart." The footsteps moved on. Pedro climbed out, gasping. He reached the storage room, picked the simple lock with his spoon handle. Inside, he found gray coveralls and rubber boots. Put them on. The window was small, high on the wall, covered by mesh screen. He climbed onto shelving, dug paint from screw heads with the spoon, and twisted. The screw gave with a screech. One by one, he removed them. 20 minutes. Bleeding knuckles. Finally, the latch hung loose. He pushed. The window was painted shut. He slammed his palm against it once, twice. Third hit. It swung open. Pedro squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping ribs, tearing coveralls, tumbled onto wet grass. He lay there looking up at stars, free. He scrambled up and ran, not fast, bad leg dragging, but with relentless determination, climbed the low fence, dropped into a drainage ditch. He walked for hours through the industrial wasteland. 5 miles. Just as the sky turned purple with dawn, he saw it. A 24-hour gas station, fluorescent sign buzzing. Pedro stumbled inside. The clerk, a teenager with piercings, reached for the alarm. "Please," Pedro croaked. "I'm not robbing you, I just need the phone." He found a crumpled $10 bill in the coverall pocket, slapped it on the counter. "One call." The kid slid over a landline. Pedro dialed, 4 rings, then a sharp voice. "This is Catherine Sterling. Who's calling at 4 in the morning?" "Catherine," Pedro whispered. "It's Pedro Gonzalez, Uncle Pedro." Silence, then alertness. "Pedro? My God, Raul said you were in a coma. Where are you?" "Shell station on Route 9. I escaped, Catherine. They took everything. The house, money, my freedom. They tried to drug me into oblivion." "Stay there. Lock the door if you can. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, a silver Mercedes screeched into the lot. Catherine Sterling stepped out, tall, trench coat over silk pajamas, fierce eyes. She rushed to Pedro, kneeling beside him. "You look terrible." Pedro managed a cracked smile. "You should see the window." She helped him into the car, blasting heat. As she shifted into gear, she looked at him with cold, dangerous fire. "Rest now, Uncle Pedro. But don't worry, we're going to get it all back, and then we're going to bury them." For 3 days, Pedro lived like a ghost in Catherine Sterling's guest house. It was a beautiful space, safe, warm, with a fridge full of food and a bed that didn't smell of despair. Catherine was already drafting motions, filing emergency injunctions, preparing a lawsuit that would hit Raul like a freight train. But legal papers took time, and Pedro's anxiety was a living thing pacing inside his chest. He couldn't just sit there drinking tea while strangers lived in his home. He needed to know what was happening. He needed ammunition. Catherine warned him against it. "It's dangerous, Uncle Pedro. If you violate the restraining order or trespass, it could hurt our case." But Pedro wasn't going there to fight. He was going there to watch. "I know every inch of that property," he said. "I built it. They won't see me." Catherine sighed, recognizing the steel in his voice. She handed him a smartphone. "At least take this. Record everything. And Pedro, be careful." Pedro waited until the moon was obscured by heavy clouds. He took a taxi to the edge of the neighborhood, then walked the last mile through the woods bordering the lake. His hip ached with every step, a constant reminder of Roberto's shove, but the pain only sharpened his focus. He knew every inch of this property. The motion sensor on the back floodlight had a 3-second delay. The camera covering the patio had a blind spot behind the azalea bushes near the retaining wall. He'd installed the system himself, never imagining he'd be the one sneaking past it. Pedro crept through the underbrush, wet leaves soaking his shoes. He reached the edge of the manicured lawn and froze. The backyard had been transformed into a grotesque carnival. Portable speakers blasted distorted bass-heavy music. Patio lights blazed. Roberto Morales stood by the massive stone fire pit, the one Pedro had built for family gatherings, holding a beer in one hand and a hatchet in the other. Next to him was Patricia, his wife, a loud woman Pedro had only met a handful of times. They were laughing. Pedro squinted, trying to see what they were doing. Roberto was struggling with the fire. "This wood is damp. I told you we should have bought charcoal." "I'm not driving to the store now," Patricia shouted over the music. "Just find something dry." Roberto looked around. His eyes landed on the covered patio area. Pedro's breath hitched. Stacked against the wall were 4 handcrafted oak chairs, not patio furniture, antiques. His grandfather had brought them from Mexico in 1920. They'd survived the Great Depression, 2 moves, and a house fire. Pedro had just moved them outside temporarily to refinish the varnish before his stroke. Roberto stumbled over to the stack. "These look dry enough." "No," Pedro whispered, his hand involuntarily reaching out. Roberto dragged the chair to the fire pit. He didn't pause to look at the craftsmanship, the century-old patina. He raised the hatchet and brought it down. There was a sickening crack. The wood splintered. It sounded like a bone breaking. He hacked at it again and again, laughing as the legs flew off. He kicked the pieces into the fire. The dry, seasoned oak caught immediately, flaring up in a bright, hot blaze. "That's better," Patricia cheered, clapping her hands. Pedro felt physical nausea rising. They were burning his history. They were warming their hands over his family's legacy because they were too lazy to drive 5 minutes to a gas station. But the horror wasn't over. As the flames rose, illuminating the patio more clearly, Pedro got a better look at Patricia. She was twirling around, holding a glass of red wine. She was wearing a long, shimmering blue gown. Pedro squeezed his eyes shut, praying he was hallucinating. He opened them again. It was undeniable. It was Letitia's dress. The midnight blue silk gown she'd worn to the charity gala 5 years ago, the last time they'd gone dancing before she got sick. They'd wrapped it in acid-free tissue paper and stored it in the cedar closet, intending to give it to a granddaughter someday. Patricia Morales, who'd never worked a day in her life, was wearing it to a backyard barbecue. The delicate fabric strained across her waist, the zipper clearly struggling. She looked like a child playing dress-up in clothes far too precious for her to understand. She took a clumsy spin, giggling. "Look at me, Roberto. I feel fancy." "You look like $1,000,000, babe," Roberto shouted, throwing another chair leg into the fire. Patricia stumbled. The wine glass tipped. A dark crimson splash washed down the front of the silk bodice. "Oops!" she shrieked, looking down at the stain. Pedro bit his lip so hard he tasted blood. That stain wouldn't come out. That dress was ruined. "Oh well," Patricia said, wiping at the silk with a greasy napkin. "It's just old rags anyway. There's plenty more in the closet. Bianca said I could take whatever I wanted." Take whatever she wanted. Bianca hadn't just moved them in. She'd given them free rein to loot his life. Pedro pulled out the smartphone Catherine had given him. His hands shook with rage so profound it felt like ice in his veins. He wanted to storm out there. He wanted to grab that hatchet and show Roberto what it felt like to be broken. But he didn't. He couldn't. Catherine's voice echoed in his head. "We need proof, Pedro. We need to show the judge they're destroying the asset." Pedro steadied his hand against a branch. He pressed record. He zoomed in on Roberto feeding the antique wood into the fire. He captured the hatchet striking the carved seat. He panned to Patricia, capturing the wine stain, the laughter, the careless way she wiped her greasy hands on the silk. He recorded their conversation, their admissions of theft, their absolute disregard for everything he held dear. The video was 3 minutes long. 3 minutes of evidence, 3 minutes of torture. When Roberto went inside to get more beer, Pedro stopped recording. He saved the file, backed it up to the cloud just as Catherine had taught him. He took one last look at his house. It looked like a monster with glowing eyes, consuming everything he loved. But as he turned to slip back into the darkness, he wasn't just a grieving widower anymore. He was a man with a weapon. He had proof. Pedro backed away from the hedge, his heart pounding. He had the video of the bonfire, but Catherine's voice whispered in his mind, They needed more than vandalism. They needed proof of intent. They needed to know the end game. He looked toward the house. The party was still raging on the patio, but it was getting colder. Soon they'd move inside. He knew exactly where they'd go. The great room with its vaulted ceilings and the massive fireplace he'd laid stone by stone. He needed to be inside, but going through a door or window was suicide. Even if they hadn't changed the alarm code, it would chime. But Pedro had a secret even Raul didn't know. When he'd built this house 35 years ago, he'd installed a dedicated service access for the main plumbing and HVAC lines, a narrow subterranean crawlspace beneath the foundation, accessible only through a camouflaged hatch in the backyard. He'd covered the hatch with a hollow artificial boulder made of fiberglass and resin, indistinguishable from the real granite rocks dotting the landscape. Pedro crept along the perimeter, staying deep in the shadows. He reached the rock garden near the back corner. There it was, the large, mossy boulder sitting undisturbed. He knelt in the damp earth and felt around the base, found the hidden latch mechanism, pressed his thumb against the release catch and pulled. The boulder, which looked like it weighed a ton, swung up silently on hidden hydraulic hinges. A rush of stale, earthy air hit his face. The dark mouth of the access tunnel yawned open. Pedro lowered himself into the hole, his feet finding the metal rungs bolted to the concrete wall. He pulled the rock closed above him, plunging into absolute darkness. He didn't dare turn on the phone's flashlight. Light could filter up through the vents and give him away. He moved by touch and memory. The rough texture of poured concrete floor, the hum of the furnace, the smell of copper pipes and insulation. He crouched low, his bad hip screaming in protest, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward through the maze of support beams and ductwork until he reached the central junction box. Directly above was the main intake vent for the heating system, a large floor-level grate hidden behind the sofa in the living room. The way he'd designed the acoustics to carry heat efficiently also made it a perfect amplifier for sound. Pedro stood slowly, pressing his ear near the metal ducting. At first, just the muffled thumping of bass. Then the sliding glass door opened and closed. Music faded. Footsteps clicked on hardwood, hard, sharp heels, Bianca, and the shuffling heavy tread of Patricia. "It's freezing out there," Patricia complained. "I need a refill. Where's the good stuff?" "Check the cabinet above the fridge," Bianca replied. "Pedro had vintage port. Raul doesn't drink it, so help yourself." Cabinet opening, bottle clinking. The port from the year Pedro and Leticia married, saved for their 50th anniversary, now being guzzled by a woman who'd used his wife's dress as a napkin. "So," Patricia said, liquid pouring into a glass, "when do we cash out? Your father's getting impatient. He wants that boat." "Not yet, Mom." Bianca's voice was closer now, likely on the sofa right above the vent. "We can't sell the house yet. Too suspicious. If we list it a week after dumping Pedro in the home, people will talk." "So what? It's your house. You have the paper." "I have the paper, yes," Bianca agreed, her tone dropping conspiratorially. "But selling takes time. Inspections, closings, taxes. I have a better plan, a faster plan." Pedro held his breath in the darkness. "What kind of plan?" "I had the house appraised yesterday, privately. You know what this place is worth? $1.8 million. And because Pedro was obsessed with paying off debt, there's no mortgage. It's free and clear." Patricia whistled. "So we sell?" "No," Bianca corrected. "We leverage. I spoke to a mortgage broker. He can rush through a cash-out refinance. We can pull out 60% of the equity immediately. That's over $1 million, Mom. Tax-free cash in our hands in 10 days. $1 million, and we keep the house? Exactly. We get the million. We take that trip to Italy. You and Dad get the boat and the new truck. I get the Mercedes, and we still live in a mansion." "But what about the payments?" Patricia asked. "$1 million loan has big payments." Bianca laughed, cold, cruel. "That's the beauty of it. I'm not signing the loan. Raul is." "Raul?" Patricia sounded confused. "He does whatever I say. I have him wrapped around my finger. He feels so guilty about putting his dad in the home that he'll do anything to make me happy. I told him we need the loan to fix up the property, to pay for Pedro's long-term care, and to invest in a business opportunity. He didn't even read the paperwork. He just nodded like a good little puppy." "So he signs the debt. He signs everything," Bianca confirmed. "The loan is in his name. The liability is his. If he can't make the payments with his salary, fine, we live here. But if he can't, or if Pedro dies and the state comes looking for assets, or if the fraud with the deed ever gets discovered. She paused, glass setting down on the coffee table. If the ship goes down, Mom, Raul is the captain. He goes to jail for fraud. He goes bankrupt, not us. We take the $1 million and we disappear. Back to Arizona, maybe Mexico. We'll be long gone before the first foreclosure notice hits the mailbox. Jesus, Bianca, Patricia giggled. You're wicked. That's my girl. He's useless anyway, Bianca sighed. Boring, spineless, and without his daddy's money, he's nothing. I tolerated him for the inheritance. Now that we have it, I don't need to tolerate him forever, just until the check clears. Pedro stood frozen in the crawl space, the metal duct digging into his forehead. The betrayal was layered now. Raul had betrayed him, yes, but Raul was also being betrayed. His son thought he was building a future with his wife. She was building a golden parachute to leave him behind in the wreckage. Pedro thought about the little boy who'd cried when his first girlfriend dumped him. He'd grown into a weak man Pedro barely recognized, but hearing his wife plan to frame him and flee broke something inside Pedro he didn't know was still intact. It wasn't just about getting his house back anymore. It was about saving the fool from the shark he'd married, or maybe letting him see the shark's teeth up close. Pedro fumbled for the phone in his pocket. The voice memo app had been recording the entire conversation through the vent. He stopped the recording, saved it. This file was a nuclear bomb. Pedro returned to Catherine's office at dawn. She'd been waiting, coffee pot empty, laptop glowing. When he played her the recording, her eyes widened. Pedro, this is gold. We can arrest them today. No, Pedro said firmly. Not yet. Catherine pulled up documents on her screen. Listen, Uncle Pedro, there's something crucial you need to understand. Remember 10 years ago, right after Aunt Letitia passed, we created a revocable living trust to protect your assets from probate and estate taxes. Pedro nodded slowly. The deed to the lake house isn't in the name of Pedro Gonzalez, individual, Catherine explained. Look, the owner of record is the Pedro Gonzalez Family Trust, and you are the sole trustee. She turned the monitor. A personal power of attorney does not grant the agent authority to act as trustee unless the trust document specifically says so, and I wrote that trust. I know it doesn't. So the transfer is void. Ab initio, void from the beginning. It's a worthless piece of paper. The house never left the trust. It's still yours. Pedro sank back. Relief washed over him, then darker realization than what Raul did. He signed a legal instrument purporting to transfer title to property he had no authority to transfer. He swore before a notary he had the right to sign. That's forgery, Pedro. That's filing a false public record. And because the property value exceeds $100,000, that's first-degree felony fraud. He goes to prison. Minimum 5 years, probably 10. And Bianca, since she's the beneficiary and we have her on tape conspiring, she goes down for conspiracy and grand larceny. Pedro closed his eyes. He hated what Raul had done. But the image of his son in an orange jumpsuit behind bars for a decade. We can end this today, Catherine said softly. Call the police, arrest them, invalidate the deed, kick them out by sunset. Pedro thought about the vent conversation, Bianca calling Raul useless, her plan to saddle him with $1 million debt and flee to Mexico. If I arrest him now, he goes to jail, yes, but he might still believe Bianca loves him. He needs to see. He needs to understand. Is there another way? Catherine studied his face. There's always another way. Catherine outlined the plan. They want to refinance, right? To get a clean first mortgage for $1 million, they need the property to be unencumbered. If there are any liens or clouds on the title, the new lender won't fund the loan. She started typing. We can play a game. I create a shell entity, a fake lending company. We file a lien on the house claiming an old unpaid debt of yours, maybe a private construction loan you supposedly took out years ago. We backdate it, make it look official. And then? Catherine smiled. We send them a notice. We tell them the lien is about to foreclose. Or we offer them a settlement. If they pay off this debt immediately, we release the lien and the title is clear for their big refinance. How much? How much did they steal from your retirement? $850,000. But they spent some. Let's say $300,000. We demand $300,000 to clear the title. They don't have $300,000. Then they'll find it, Catherine said. Bianca wants that $1,000,000 loan so bad she can taste it. If she thinks a $300,000 payment is the only thing standing in her way, she'll bleed Raul dry to get it. Pedro sat back. It was brilliant, ruthless. They'll effectively take the money they stole from you plus whatever else they have and deposit it right back into an account that only you control. They'll think they're paying off a debt to clear the way for their big score. In reality, they're refunding your retirement. And after they pay, then we drop the hammer. We show up, we reveal the fraud, we take the house back, and by then they're broke, exposed, and have nowhere to run. Pedro looked at her. Do it. Make them pay. Catherine registered a Delaware shell company in 24 hours. Apex Capital Management. She drafted an email, a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Subject: Final notice of default and intent to foreclose to Raul Gonzalez. This letter serves as final notice that a secondary construction lien dating back to a renovation commissioned by Pedro Gonzalez in 2019 is currently in default. Due to a clerical error during the recent title transfer, the debt has been accelerated. Amount due, $300,000. Deadline, 48 hours. If payment is not received by wire transfer, we will exercise our right to foreclose immediately, regardless of who currently holds the deed. Sincerely, Apex Capital Legal Department. Ready to go fishing? Catherine asked. Do it. She pressed send. The trap was set. 3 hours later, Catherine's tracking software pinged. The email had been opened, twice, then forwarded. They're panicking, Catherine said. At noon, her phone rang. Blocked number. She put it on speaker. This is Apex Capital Legal Department. Yes, hello. Raul, breathless. I received a notice regarding the Gonzalez property. There must be a mistake. We hold the deed. The title search was clean. Catherine didn't miss a beat. Sir, title searches often miss private equity liens filed under legacy statutes. The debt is valid. We've already initiated foreclosure filing. Unless the balance is settled by close of business tomorrow, the sheriff will be serving eviction notices Monday. But $300,000? We don't have that kind of liquidity. Can we work out a payment plan? I'm afraid not. Full payment or foreclosure. Those are your options. Have a nice day. She hung up before he could beg. Now watch, Catherine said, pulling up the bank accounts. For an hour, nothing. Then frantic activity began. 1:30 p.m. Transfer of $50,000, what's left of stolen cash. 2 p.m. Credit card cash advance. $20,000, maxing out cards. 2:17 p.m. Online listing posted. 2023 Sundancer boat, fire sale, must go today. 3:45 p.m. Wire from pawn shop. $10,000. Raul pawned something. 4:20 p.m. Wire from hard money lender. $150,000. Predatory loan shark. 4:55 p.m. Final wire from Morales. Holdings $10,000. Bianca forced Roberto to pay. They're cannibalizing themselves, Catherine said, burning everything they have, taking on massive bad debt, selling assets at a loss, all to pay a lien that doesn't exist. At 4:57 p.m., the status changed. Completed. $300,000 transferred from Raul Gonzalez to Apex Capital Management, which was wholly owned by the Pedro Gonzalez Family Trust. Catherine slumped back. We got them, Uncle Pedro. It cleared. Pedro stared at the screen. $300,000. Not the full $850,000 they'd stolen, but a start. And more importantly, money they had bled for. Right now, Pedro said, they're probably popping champagne. They think they've won. They think the path is open for their $1 million refinance. He stood, buttoning his jacket. Send them the lien release. Let them think they're clear. Let them schedule the closing for their big loan. He walked to the window. Next week, they're having a housewarming party. Bianca posted the invite online. She wants to show off. Catherine raised an eyebrow. You want to crash it? No, Pedro smiled coldly. I want to host it. It's my house after all. Get the paperwork ready, Catherine, and call the sheriff. We have an eviction to perform. The week that followed was a masterclass in preparation. Catherine sent the lien release document, officially recorded, acting like a key unlocking a cage. To Raul and Bianca, it was the green light they'd been desperate for. The title was clear. The path to their $1 million cash-out refinance was wide open. Pedro monitored their digital footprint. The loan application was finalized. The appraisal was accepted. The closing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. But before the closing, Bianca needed her victory lap. She sent out digital invitations for an exclusive housewarming gala. The theme, Lakeside Elegance. Dress code, cocktail attire. She hired a high-end catering company, a live jazz quartet, and valet service. She was spending money she hadn't even secured yet, confident the bank wire was just days away. Pedro spent that week transforming. He went to a barber, trimmed beard, cut hair. He visited a tailor Catherine recommended and bought a charcoal gray Italian wool suit, crisp white shirt, and silk tie. He polished his shoes until they shone like mirrors. When he looked in the mirror on the day of the party, the frail, confused old man from Sunny Meadows was gone. In his place stood Pedro Gonzalez, the man who had built half this town. I wasn't Pedro the victim anymore, he said to his reflection. I was going home. The evening of the party was warm and breezy, the kind of perfect summer night that usually brought peace. As they drove toward the lake, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. Pedro wasn't driving his truck. That was gone, sold by his son. He sat in the back of a rented Rolls-Royce Phantom, a massive silent beast that whispered power. Beside him sat Catherine in a sharp black blazer. In the front passenger seat was Sheriff Davis, carrying a thick file of arrest warrants. Behind them, 2 black SUVs followed, carrying private security and deputies Davis had hand-picked. They turned onto the private road. Through the trees, Pedro could see the glow of the party. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, Land Rovers, Porsches, Mercedes. Bianca had invited everyone she wanted to impress. The house itself was lit up like a palace. String lights hung from the trees Pedro had planted. Waiters in white jackets circulated with silver trays. The jazz band played a smooth, upbeat tune. It looked beautiful. It looked expensive. It looked like theft in progress. They stopped at the iron gates. A young valet stepped forward, clipboard in hand, looking confused by the convoy. Name, please? He asked, peering into the tinted window. Catherine rolled down the glass. The owner, open the gate. The valet hesitated, looking at his list. I don't see an owner on the list. Mr. Gonzalez is already inside. Open the gate, son, Sheriff Davis said, leaning over, uniform visible, or I'll open it with my bumper. The valet's eyes went wide. He scrambled to the keypad and punched in the code. The heavy iron gate swung inward. The Rolls-Royce rolled up the long, winding driveway, gravel crunching under heavy tires. The sound cut through the music. They didn't stop at the valet stand. The car continued rolling slowly, past the stunned guests, right up to the edge of the patio where the main crowd was gathered. The music faltered, died. The chatter of the crowd dropped to a confused murmur. All eyes turned toward the driveway. On the raised stone terrace, standing exactly where he'd shoved Pedro days before, stood Roberto Morales. He was wearing a white linen suit that was too tight across the middle, holding a glass of champagne high in the air. He'd evidently been in the middle of a toast. I didn't mean to interrupt, Roberto boomed, his voice slurring slightly, but looks like we have some late arrivals, probably some VIPs Bianca forgot to tell me about. As I was saying, when I bought this place, I knew it needed a vision. I bought this place. The lie hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The driver opened Pedro's door. He stepped out. His Italian leather shoes hit the pavement with a solid, authoritative click. He stood to his full height, buttoning his jacket. He held the silver-headed cane, not as a crutch, but as a scepter. Catherine stepped out beside him, Sheriff Davis from the front. The deputies from the SUVs fanned out, silent and professional. A hush fell over the party, not the polite silence of a lull in conversation, the heavy, suffocating silence of shock. The guests looked from the imposing vehicles to the 3 of them standing in formation. They didn't know who Pedro was. To them, he was just a stranger in an expensive suit. But Bianca knew. She was standing near the bar, holding court with a group of women in cocktail dresses. She turned when the music stopped, annoyed at the interruption. Her eyes scanned the scene until they landed on Pedro. Her face went slack. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers. It hit the stone patio with a sharp crystalline shatter that echoed like a gunshot. Champagne splashed over her designer heels, but she didn't move. She stared at Pedro as if seeing a corpse that had clawed its way out of the grave. Raúl was standing near the buffet table, laughing at something a friend had said. He turned at the sound of breaking glass, looked at his wife, followed her gaze to Pedro. The color drained from his face so fast Pedro thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. He took a stumbling step forward, hands shaking. Dad? He stammered, voice barely a whisper. You're supposed to be... I thought you were dead. I mean, the hospital. You're supposed to be in the home. Pedro didn't say a word, just looked at him. Let the silence stretch. Let his words hang there, exposing him to everyone present. Roberto, realizing the attention had shifted, squinted down from the terrace. Who's the party crasher? Bianca, security. Get them out. This is private property. Pedro looked up at Roberto. He smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. He walked toward the terrace stairs. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, guests shrinking away from the cold aura of authority radiating from their group. Pedro climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, the tap of his cane marking time. He reached the top and stood face to face with Roberto. Up close, Roberto smelled of sweat and greed. He looked at Pedro, recognition dawning in his watery eyes. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by genuine terror. Pedro reached out and plucked the microphone from his hand. Roberto didn't resist. He was too busy trembling. Pedro tapped the microphone twice. Thump, thump. The sound boomed through the speakers, making a few guests jump. "Good evening, everyone," Pedro said, his voice calm, deep and steady. "I apologize for the interruption. I know you're all enjoying the hospitality." He swept his gaze across the crowd, making eye contact with confused socialites. "My name is Pedro Gonzalez, and I am the owner of this house." A gasp rippled through the crowd. People began to whisper, looking at each other in confusion. Pedro turned to Raúl, who was now standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at him like a condemned man at the gallows. "I'm not dead, son," Pedro said into the microphone. "And I'm not in the home. I'm right here, and I've come to collect the rent." "Welcome to my home," Pedro continued, his voice carrying across the silent garden. "I'm sorry I'm late. I was busy at the bank withdrawing the very generous financial gift my son and daughter-in-law just wired to me." The crowd murmured. Confused glances exchanged between guests. Bianca went pale, her eyes darting from Pedro to the sheriff. Raúl looked like he was about to vomit. "Gift?" Raúl squeaked. "What gift?" "The $300,000 you sent to Apex Capital yesterday," Pedro explained, his tone conversational as if discussing the weather. "You see, Apex Capital isn't a bank. It's a holding company owned entirely by the Pedro Gonzalez Family Trust, by me." Bianca let out a strangled sound, her hands flying to her mouth. "You stole money from my retirement account," Pedro continued, addressing the crowd now. "You sold my boat. You borrowed from loan sharks. And then you wired every single cent of it right back into my account. You thought you were paying off a lien to clear the title so you could mortgage my house. In reality, you were just returning what you stole, with interest." "You tricked us!" Bianca shrieked, her composure shattering completely. "That's fraud! You committed fraud!" Sheriff Davis stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "Actually, ma'am, the fraud was committed when your husband forged his father's signature on a quit-claim deed, when he filed a false public record to steal a property worth $1.8 million. And when you conspired with him to do it." He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked ominously in the silence. "Raúl Gonzalez, you're under arrest for first-degree forgery, elder abuse, and grand larceny." Raúl's knees buckled. Two deputies moved in, catching him before he hit the ground. They spun him around, pulling his arms behind his back. The click of the cuffs was the loudest sound in the world. "Dad!" Raúl sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "Dad, please, tell them it was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake, son," Pedro said, looking down at him from the terrace. "It was a choice. You chose to erase me. You chose to lock me in a cage." Bianca tried to back away, looking for an exit, but Catherine stepped into her path. "And you must be Bianca," Catherine said, her voice sharp as a blade. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and I believe the district attorney is also adding a charge of identity theft." "No!" Bianca screamed as a female deputy grabbed her wrist. I paid the $300,000. The house is mine. I have the receipt." "That money wasn't a payment for the house," Pedro said coldly. "Consider it back rent and compensation for the emotional damage you caused. You paid for your own eviction, Bianca." While the deputies wrangled the screaming couple, Pedro saw movement near the side gate. Roberto and Patricia Morales were trying to slip away into the shadows, walking fast toward their car. Roberto was carrying a large, heavy bag. "Sheriff," Pedro said, pointing the cane, "don't let them leave." Deputies intercepted them before they could reach the driveway. Roberto tried to bluster, shouting about his rights, but the deputies ignored him. They opened the bag Roberto was clutching. Inside was Pedro's antique mantel clock, the silver candlesticks from the dining room, and a jewelry box containing the rest of Letitia's collection. "Possession of stolen property," Sheriff Davis said, shaking his head. "And since you entered this property knowing it was obtained through fraud, we're adding criminal trespassing and burglary." They handcuffed Roberto and Patricia right there on the lawn. Patricia began to wail, her expensive new dress now stained with grass and dirt as she struggled. The party was over. The guests, realizing they were witnessing a crime scene, began to scatter, rushing to their cars to avoid being associated with the scandal. Pedro watched them go. He watched the police cars, their lights flashing red and blue, illuminating the facade of the house he'd built. They dragged Raul past him toward the patrol car. He stopped, looking up at Pedro with red, puffy eyes. He looked like a child again, scared and small. "Dad, help me," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Please, I'm your son. Don't let them take me." Pedro looked at him, looked at the man who had left him to rot in a room with moldy bread, looked at the man who had let his wife plan to frame him. He felt a deep, aching sadness, but the well of sympathy was dry. "I didn't send you to prison, Raul," Pedro said softly. "You sent yourself, the moment you signed that deed. You chose your family, son. You chose Bianca and her parents over me, so ask them for help." They shoved Raul into the back of the car. He slumped against the window, sobbing. Pedro turned away. He couldn't watch anymore. 6 months later, the lake house was sold. It sold for $2.1 million. Ironically, the cosmetic renovations Bianca had paid for with stolen money, the painting, the landscaping, the modern fixtures, had increased the value significantly. Pedro took the money, added the $300,000 they'd wired him, combined it with what was left of his retirement funds. He didn't buy another house, too many ghosts, too many memories of what was lost. Instead, he bought a 45-foot luxury RV. It had a king-sized bed, a full kitchen with granite countertops, heated floors. It was a palace on wheels. Pedro stood in the dealer lot looking at the gleaming silver beast. It represented something he hadn't had in 40 years. Total, absolute freedom. He opened the passenger door. Amigo, his old golden retriever, hopped in. The dog had gained weight since Pedro got him back. His coat was shiny again. He settled into the leather seat, tail wagging, ready for adventure. "Hey, boy," Pedro whispered, burying his hands in the thick fur. "Ready to see the country?" Pedro climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, a powerful, steady hum. He adjusted the mirrors, put on his sunglasses. He wasn't Pedro the victim. He wasn't Pedro the old man in the nursing home. He was Pedro, the traveler. He pulled out of the lot and turned onto the highway heading west. The road stretched out before him, endless and open. He was going to see the Grand Canyon, the redwoods, fish in Montana, watch the sunrise in the desert. He had no mortgage. No ungrateful children waiting for their inheritance. No heavy secrets weighing him down. Pedro looked in the rearview mirror one last time, watching the city fade into the distance. He thought about Raul sitting in a cell, learning the hard way that character costs more than money. He hoped he would learn. He hoped that one day, years from now, his son would understand. But for now, Pedro had a map, a full tank of gas, and his best friend beside him. Sitting in my RV watching the sunset, Pedro thought, I realized that blind tolerance is poison to a child's character. I gave Raul everything, transforming him into a weak, greedy man. When he pushed me to the brink, I had to be ruthless. Letting him go to prison wasn't an act of hatred. It was the final, harsh lesson on responsibility I never taught him before. Pedro smiled, shifting gears. Never let the word family rob you of your self-respect. The most valuable asset you own isn't a lake house. It's your freedom and your dignity. He glanced at Amigo, who was already dozing in the passenger seat, completely at peace. We were going to be just fine, Pedro said aloud. We were free. The highway stretched ahead, disappearing into the golden horizon. Behind him, the past grew smaller and smaller. Ahead, the future was an open road. For the first time in months, maybe years, Pedro Gonzalez felt something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. And as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Pedro pressed the accelerator and drove toward whatever came next. The last legacy of Pedro Gonzalez wasn't a house by the lake. It wasn't money in the bank or property deeds or family heirlooms. It was this: the courage to walk away from what was poisoning him, and the wisdom to know that sometimes the greatest inheritance you can leave behind is the lesson that actions have consequences, even for family, especially for family. The RV hummed along the highway, carrying two souls who'd been through hell and come out the other side. And in that moment, that was enough.